Hello, everyone. I'm Russ Barkley, and welcome to the first of what I hope will be many short commentaries on topics that are currently in the media or that are in responses to questions that I've received on the website. Today, I want to speak with you about this concept of neurodiversity or neurodivergence that we encounter periodically, especially in the trade media. There, it's often used to express the idea that because ADHD or other neurodevelopmental disorders like autism spectrum represent a continuum of symptoms within the population, that we should not view them as psychopathologies or mental disorders or even as disorders. They're simply part of normal human variation in certain traits. And therefore, people should not necessarily be diagnosed. And some extreme advocates even go to the point of arguing that there should not even be additional or unusual treatments applied to individuals who fall at the extreme ends of these distributions. So I just want to address this concept because I find it very troubling and that I think it misrepresents the science of ADHD. I think it goes too far in arguing against the concept of labeling. I understand that that concept or that labels have stigma at times, though the stigma associated with ADHD has certainly been declining markedly of late. And I also understand that people want to have a more compassionate view of these conditions. But as you can see, there's a downside to that argument when it's taken to the extreme, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But in the meantime, in order to address this idea of neurodiversity, I've created a slide here for you of what is a normal bell curve. And I'm going to build this slide in pieces so that you can understand this concept. So yes, ADHD represents a continuum of symptoms within the population. Some people have very little, if any, ADHD. Other people have lots of symptoms. And there is a continuum in the population. So we can represent this continuum as that of a typical bell curve, like you would see for height or weight, or you're familiar with the bell curve of intelligence and so on. So this is the bell curve of a trait within the population. Now, we have to ask the question, what is the trait that ADHD represents? It isn't ADHD. What is the normal trait of which ADHD represents the extreme lower dimension of? In other words, what is failing to develop appropriately during development that would lead to someone having ADHD symptoms? And of course, as you know from my other videos here, I believe that ADHD is a major deficit across most, if not all, of the 7 executive functions. And since the executive functions are necessary for human self-regulation, ADHD really represents the extreme end of the curve of self-regulation. So we have this trait in the human population. It is largely under genetic influence. This distribution of traits, which we're going to call executive functioning and self-regulation, this distribution is under very tight genetic control. How do we know that? Because over 75 to 80% of the variance, and in some cases over 90% of the variation in the human population along this trait is accounted for by genetic variation in the human genome. Now, that figure nearly approaches the genetic contribution to variation in human height, and it far exceeds the genetic contribution to intelligence, personality, depression, and anxiety, for instance, among other forms of mental distress. The last two I'm referring to, of course. So we can see then that there is this bell curve of self-regulation, and that ADHD likely represents the lower tail of this distribution of genetically influenced variation in the population. Now, I do want to make the point that some cases of ADHD, upwards of perhaps 30%, particularly in boys, is not genetic, but arises from injury to the brain as a result of exposure to biohazards, both prenatally and after birth, that can create an acquired form of ADHD. But it still falls toward the lower end of this distribution of this trait of self-regulation, even if it isn't there as a result of genetic variation. Now, we can take this curve and we can parse it up by saying that in the central area here, there is genetic variation that is what we would call the typical range of neurodiversity. And if we go above the mean, which is right here, there are people who are above average in self-regulation. And if we go way up here to the upper tail of this distribution, there are people that we would call gifted in their self-regulation, falling from about this line all the way up to the uppermost regions of self-control, very much like we see in intelligence and the gifted part of the normal distribution of intelligence in the population. Now, there is also a below average group of individuals in self-regulation. They're not necessarily impaired. They function pretty typically, but they're certainly not as talented in self-regulation as the people are on this side of the bell curve. But nevertheless, these people fall well within neurodiverse, typical range of the genetic and neurological distribution that leads to ADHD. However, there reaches a point where the executive deficits in ADHD, that is self-regulation, become sufficiently deficient or low that the individual begins to have symptoms of ADHD, the inattention, the impulsivity, the emotional impulsivity and expression, the hyperactivity, and so on. And that's going to be down here at about 1 to 1.5 standard deviations below the population. Now, these people may not get a diagnosis. If you want to call them a ADHD personality, they're just sort of sparkling and effervescent and talkative and gregarious, outgoing, probably extroverted. That's fine, but they're going to begin to have some symptoms of the disorder. But they're not diagnosable because even though they fall toward the lower side of this curve, we do not see evidence of significant impairment in major life activities or significant harm, such as increased mortality or morbidity. So they're symptomatic but not diagnosable. And then we reach this point in the curve, and I'm going to draw the line right about here, where we start to see people who are impaired. The symptoms are leading to harm. The environment is kicking back against the expression of these frequent and often severe symptoms of deficits in executive functioning, or if you prefer, higher levels of symptoms of ADHD. So it is at this point where harm develops and impairment occurs that we draw a line and make the diagnosis of ADHD. Now, where that line is drawn is a little arbitrary, but arbitrary doesn't mean meaningless. The further out on this distribution of self-regulation you are, out here, the more likely you're going to be impaired, the more impairments you're going to have, and the greater the likelihood you might experience increased injury or morbidity, or even, as I said in my health outcomes video, increased mortality. So at some point, impairment will occur. And where it does, we are entitled to draw a line and make a diagnosis. Now, you might say, well, why do we have to draw that line? Because we have decisions to make. As I've explained in one of my earlier commentaries on research, categorical decisions have to be made in clinical practice. Do we prescribe for you or not? Do we give you accommodations under the ADA or not? Does a child with ADHD get special services in school or not? There's no halfway measure here. We either act or we don't. And so consequently, part of the reason we have to create categories out of dimensions in psychology, particularly when we're dealing with these kinds of disorders, is because categorical decisions get made. And that's how it is. If you want services, if you want entitlements, if you want protections, if you want support under the Social Security Disability Act, and all of the other things that people with ADHD may be entitled to, then a categorical decision has to get made. We can't give you those things and then turn around and say that this is your superpower, this is your gift, you're just part of normal variation, there's no reason to label, there's no reason to treat. Do you see how silly that is? We're not going to go down the halls of Congress and argue for entitlements and protections in various federal regulations for people with ADHD, and at the same time champion ADHD as some kind of gift or simply part of normal variation that otherwise does no harm but represents some extreme neurodivergence. So let's not get too far down this road of neurodiversity where we recognize that ADHD is part of a normal continuum. But then we go on to conclude that as a result, there's no reason for us to have to draw attention to them, label them, diagnose them, give them services or treatment, and so on. We do. And the reason we have to do that is because ADHD causes harm. And my profession and psychiatry and related professions exist in order to reduce harm in individuals. Our job is to alleviate distress, to alleviate impairment. That's why we exist. That's why you come to us. That's why you pay us. So you can't have these professions that exist to treat impairment in the population and at the same time say there's no disorder here and therefore we don't need the alleviation of distress in these people. Most people I know with ADHD don't view it as a gift or superpower and would gladly give it up in a heartbeat if they had the choice, but they don't. So I hope you can understand that on the one hand, ADHD is part of the normal bell curve, the normal continuum of self-regulation in the population. On the other hand, as people fall toward the more and more deficient range of self-regulation, harm begins to occur. And at that point, because of their distress and their risks, they have the right to seek a diagnosis and treatment in order to get access to the various treatments, protections, and entitlements that we have hard won over the course of the history of ADHD, particularly since the 1990s. So I am against this extreme form of the neurodivergence or diversity movement that says there's no harm here and labeling should not occur. But I certainly support those more reasonable individuals who argue that yes, this is part of normal variation. But at the extreme end of normal variation, harm and impairment can occur. And these people have the right and are entitled to diagnosis, treatment, and other services. So I hope that helps you to understand in a more complicated and nuanced way these concepts of neurodiversity and neurodivergence. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you on other commentaries in the future.